Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Thissen-Milder, also known as MTM, with the Minnesota Department of Education. Welcome to MNSHAPE 2020. What a crazy time. Never would I have dreamed that we would be in the situation we're in today. I've been in education since 1980. Yeah, that's a really long time. And I've loved every minute of it because I get to work with great teachers like you who are passionate and committed to providing our students with the greatest foundation you can in physical education and health education. But the truth of the matter is, I've experienced absolutely nothing in these past 40 years, even close to what's been happening in our world over the past 8 months. Nor would I guess have any of you. And I've honestly been trying to figure out how to cope with it. Due to this, for MNSHAPE this year, I wanted to take a broader perspective of the work we all do as health leaders in health education and physical education. You've all definitely been on my mind these past 8 months. As I thought about our time together today, I've struggled. As educators, we're facing a tremendous challenge. I first simply want to thank you all for your grace over these months, navigating everything you've faced. From trying to figure out distance learning last spring to now working in multiple learning models, your stress levels and tensions are numerous. The reality is the COVID-19 pandemic is one thing, but add to that an environment of social justice unrest and a hostile political environment, it really is beyond anything I could have ever imagined. So here's where I've landed with my time with you today. We have all been affected by what's happening in our environment. We are all experiencing abrupt interruptions in our daily lives, and we're trying to adjust to this new normal while we manage complex emotions like anxiety or fear, loneliness, and grief. I'm going to take a few minutes to put things into context about what's happened in our lives the last 8 months that's impacting us on every level. And then we'll talk about how we've responded and the importance of, now more than ever, the critical role we play as school health leaders in health and physical education. We'll talk about that foundation and provide some answers to some common questions I've been answering from the field. I'd like to frame our conversation today by talking about what I can only describe as collisions of three different pandemics. A collision is an instance of one moving object or person striking violently against another, and it couldn't have been more true these past 8 months. Our first collision was the impact of COVID-19 that changed our lives as we knew it. The coronavirus pandemic began impacting our world in March and much earlier in other places. We had a stay-at-home executive order from the governor. The goal of the order was to buy time for the state's healthcare system to gear up for the coming peak in cases. We began to feel the restrictions of what we could and couldn't do. The main focus today is for us to talk about the school story. In March, we began to have temporary school shutdowns until we finally were notified by our governor in April that the school closures would extend towards the rest of the academic year. That impact was far-reaching. Last spring, in many of our districts, there was an immediate discovery of the lack of broadband access. Some of you were trying to deliver hotspots, and some students even drove to school parking lots to access the internet. In some places, broadband wasn't available at all for Minnesota students. In addition, the governor's initial school closure order required schools to continue mental health services for students and deliver meals for children that needed them, as well as offering childcare for workers. The decision also left students in a place that they'd never been. High school seniors faced the fact that they'd finished their senior year without experiencing high school graduations filled with loved ones celebrating their monumental moment. Typical norms for schools in the spring for all students like prom, spring sports, theater, music, art, and all the other wonderful extracurriculars also didn't occur. The good news is that many of you did some very creative things for your students to provide some sort of celebration, which was awesome. But at the end of the year, it was clear that distance learning had put incredible stress not only on you and your students, but on parents and caregivers as well. It was also widening disparities by wealth, race, and geography. This was all happening from March to May. Then the COVID pandemic collided with social justice, or I should say social injustice in Minnesota. George Floyd was killed on May 25th. As details about Floyd's death came out, there were protests and riots. There was unrest in the city, on our streets, in our neighborhoods, and that spread all over the state and later all over the country and yes, even the world. It took 8 days for charges to be filed. And here comes another collision. Politics step in. Even before COVID, teachers were struggling with trying to help students navigate the current political environment. But after COVID and the social justice messaging in Minneapolis, across our state and the country, the political environment seemed to ramp up across party lines about how to best assist states in dealing with COVID-19 amidst social unrest. I want to take a moment here to acknowledge that all these pandemics have impacted each and every one of us. No matter where you are, the struggle is real. If we were together, now is the time I would ask you how you're doing and how we could chat a bit, because we know as health educators and physical educators that being able to express our personal reactions is part of your self-care and provide opportunities for our students to do that well. I, like you, had to figure out how to move through all these emotions because the reality is life goes on, work continues, and just like you, my learning curve has been and is still high. So air hugs to you all, and thanks for hanging in there. So getting back to our timeline, in late July, our Governor Tim Walz announced that he was leaving the big back-to-school format decision up to public school districts and charter schools. The approach paired the knowledge and data from our departments of health and education with the expertise of our local school districts to make the best decisions for our students across the state. There are 3 plans in Minnesota that educators need to pay attention to as they selected their learning models and implemented their plans. First was the Minnesota Stay Safe Plan. The next was the Minnesota Department of Health Plan. And the third is the Minnesota Department of Education guidelines for the 2021 school year. There were 5 steps in the state plan to determine your learning model at the local level. The first step is all about your 14-day county levels. Levels are determined by the case rate divided by the county population, 10,000, and that is your 14-day county data level case rate per 10,000. 0 to 9 meant you were in person for all K-12. 10 to 19, you were in person for elementary, hybrid for secondary. 20 to 29, hybrid for all K-12. 30 to 49, hybrid for elementary, distance learning for secondary, and 50 plus, distance learning for all. And then there were steps beyond the data. Other health requirements also were part of the checklist. To be in school or in hybrid, people had to have a masking policy, PPE for direct student services, have a routine of hygiene education and practices, daily cleaning, and have a COVID-19 program coordinator and student counterpart. You had to limit non-essential visitors, volunteers, and discontinue large gatherings and activities that didn't allow for social distancing. If you were in hybrid, social distancing of 6 feet at all times in school buildings had to occur. In school facilities at 50% capacity, transportation at 50%, sufficient staffing levels to meet the requirements of the model. And speaking of a masking policy, we also do have that governor's order requiring all Minnesotans over the age of 5 to wear a face covering in all indoor businesses and public indoor spaces and outdoors in situations where social distancing cannot be maintained. At the time of this recording, that order is still in place. It definitely has impacted our worlds in health and physical education, and I'll get to the specifics of that more later. And for those of you responsible for athletics, we began a huge roller coaster ride about interscholastic activities. Spring sports didn't happen. Summer youth activities were allowed as long as CDC and MDH sports guidelines were followed. In early August, it was determined some fall sports would happen, but football and volleyball would be moved to the spring due to the close contact of football and the fact that volleyball was being held inside. But now, as you know, this decision was reversed in late September. It was also recently released that a winter sports could occur, but it would be at 30% capacity. Well, we have definitely had major bumps in the implementation road in our state plan. Health educators and physical educators' concerns were numerous. Every model provided major worries. If you were in school, social distancing, masks, hygiene, disinfecting, how to organize, personal stress and health concerns, and how to assist students with special needs were always of major concern. If you were distance learning, many of you still felt unprepared for the distance learning. There was a lack of equipment and broadband. We all could recognize the inequitable home life of students, and again, being unsure of how to help students with special needs. And we definitely had major bumps in the road in our state plan around a hybrid. All the worries of both in-person and distance learning on top of trying to balance them at the same time. Some of your schools decided right up front to start the year in a distance learning format. But in rural areas, especially where the virus has been slower to spread, the decisions were harder. Administrators stated that the desire to open buildings for in-person learning was huge in the communities. Some communities called the virus a hoax, and some surveys said that students should definitely be in school no matter what the count. Many outstate students were started either in person or in hybrid learning. However, ever since school started, there's been significant increases in cases in rural counties, causing changes in those models. And then there's the parental exhaustion and confusion and feeling of being overwhelmed. I have absolutely no control over all these big picture issues of the teaching model decisions. The irony is that everything about our decision making for schools centers around health and safety, which is all what we are about and that what we have to offer schools. Never before has the connection been clearer between education and health than during COVID-19. If we don't prioritize health, teaching and learning will be compromised. Our work as school health leaders over the years has been grounded in the whole school model. I believe experiencing COVID has made this model leap from the paper and identifies, particularly for those outside our field, all the health connections that are critical in providing the foundation for safe and healthy schools and supports a safe space for learning. This is the time where our health and physical education standards provide applicable knowledge and skills needed to navigate all these pandemics. They help students making healthy decisions and be able to explain the importance of wearing a mask or physical distancing. They help students express themselves in reactions to social injustices that are highlighted in their worlds every day. And they help students analyze the current political environment and the impact it's having on themselves and their families. One of the questions I often hear is whether standards are still required due to the COVID epidemic. And the answer is yes, standards are still required to be met. Our state statute directs all academic standards in physical education, the arts, science, math, English language arts, and social studies are to be required for all students with grade level benchmarks. Local standard development is required for health education, and instruction must be provided in each of the standard areas by a licensed instructor for all students from K to 12. So what are the state health education requirements? All school districts in Minnesota are required to identify standards, benchmarks, curriculum, and assessments in health education. All students must receive instruction in health education K to 8 or by district determined grade bands. High school students must receive instruction in health education at least once. The amount of credit and graduation requirement is determined at the district level. The Minnesota Department of Education recommends that districts use the National Health Education Standards. They establish and promote support health-enhancing behaviors for all students in grades to 12. We do have a document on our Minnesota Department of Education website that can serve as a guide for districts as they develop their locally developed. They also provide sample grade-specific benchmarks for K-12 health education. What are the Minnesota physical education requirements? All students must receive instruction in physical education K-8 every year. High school students must receive instruction in physical education at least once. The amount of credit and graduation requirement is determined at the local level. Currently, K-12 schools are required to implement the Minnesota 2010 Physical Education Standards and develop their own grade level benchmarks, curriculum, and assessments to meet them. It's important to note that K physical education standards are changing. We have now developed the 2018 Minnesota K-12 academic standards and grade level benchmarks that are to be fully implemented in all Minnesota schools by the 2021-22 school year. Full implementation is defined as by 2021-22, instruction in physical education in grades K-8 must include all those standards and benchmarks. Instruction at the high school level must include those standards and benchmarks for grades 9 to 12, beginning with the 2021-22 freshman or 9th grade class. All school districts are required to develop assessments to ensure students are meeting those benchmarks. Another common question I get is concerning teacher reassignments during COVID, especially at the elementary level. We're hearing many stories about physical education teachers being reassigned to assist classroom teachers and physical education being put on hold. Teacher reassignment is field permission and is regulated by licensure, or PELSB, not MDE. PELSB dedicated several webinars about out-of-field permissions and can be found on the PELSB website under districts. If a district or school determines educational needs can be best served by out-of-field permissions, the teacher can sign off, indicating that they accept the assignment. However, districts must be able to identify where standards are being met for the required content areas, and this is MDE's area of expertise. For example, if a physical educator is reassigned, the district should be able to identify when the school year students will receive instruction in the required physical education standards and when it will be received by a licensed physical educator. In some cases, a physical educator may be reassigned to assist a classroom teacher for the first semester, but would return to their normal physical education assignment the second semester to meet the state standard requirement. And about physical education standards professional development. We were in the midst of a 3-year implementation plan to get all of us ready for full implementation of our new physical education standards and grade level benchmarks. We've spent a lot of time looking at those standards and benchmarks and talking about their language, academic language, and the learning progressions. We talked about how to deconstruct them and how to bundle them. And then last year we took a time out to talk about assessment and grading and explored best practices in those areas. And then came COVID. So another question I'm also hearing is, will there be a 3rd year of workshop for physical education? Yes, there will. Even though COVID-19 has disrupted our 3-year in-person professional development implementation plan for the new standards, for now, our new plan is to go virtual with the professional development offering and develop and post helpful resources for the 2020-21 school year. MDE is working with MNSHAPE and MNDAPE to provide physical educators key information in all the different learning scenarios. And we also have resources that are posted on the 2019 website that talk about the guidance for physical education, what are some examples of physical education activities that meet benchmarks for distance learning or for in-school during physical distancing, and what are some common best practices in online physical education. One new resource I want to make sure you know about is the MDE Physical Education Guidance for the 2021 school year. It covers what's required for physical education by our state Stay Safe plan and the Minnesota Department of Health's plan by identifying health guidance when students are in school, engaged in hybrid or in distance learning. It addresses the importance of maintaining the E in physical education so our students continue to learn about movement while they're in movement. It covers the 3 learning scenarios and identifies key considerations that cross them all and instructional assessment considerations in each learning model. I've recorded a webinar specific to that guidance tool that goes into detail about the content and can be found on the MDE COVID webpage under Instruction and Academic Standards. To assist both health and physical education, I want to tell you about a new website at MDE that's designed to help you navigate through the COVID content. This is happening through our CDC 1801 supplemental funding. The Minnesota Departments of Health and Education are creating a resource through the Canvas learning management system. All resources and trainings identified are specific to COVID. There are sections of health and safety, meal and snack programs, physical education and physical activity, social emotional learning, mental health, and out of school time. The site is scheduled to launch soon. This slide shows some examples of the professional development offerings that will be part of that site. I've been working with MNSHAPE to answer questions coming up around COVID, and they've created something called the COVID Corner on their website where teachers can submit questions regarding the pandemic and impact on health and physical education. These next slides have a few of them. The first question is, can physical educators use or share equipment? The answer is yes. The MDE physical education document addresses equipment use and sanitation on pages 5 to 8. Sanitation is a huge issue for physical education. Please limit the use of physical education equipment and eliminate the use of equipment that could be passed between or shared by multiple students throughout a class period. Try not to use cloth or porous materials because they're difficult to properly clean. For equipment that will be touched or handled by students, assign each student their own piece of equipment for that class period, and then properly clean and disinfect the equipment between classes. If there's not equitable equipment for all students, or if equipment cannot be properly cleaned or disinfected between classes, avoid the use of equipment altogether. If using equipment, keep extra materials available in case a piece of equipment being used by a student becomes dirty or unsanitary during a lesson or activity. I want to stress this because this question comes up often. How often should we be cleaning equipment? As said in the earlier slide, best practice is to clean equipment after every class if the same equipment is to be used in any other classes during the school day. We realize this may be time consuming, but all guidance documents address the need to disinfect between use and if the equipment is being shared. And again, the MDE guidance document addresses that on pages 5 through 8. Should students be allowed to participate in elementary physical education with their mask off in an indoor setting for all activities? Best practice is that students can remove their masks indoors during physical activity, but should put them back on during instruction. When outdoors, masks can be removed as long as students physically distance, and this is referenced under face coverings in the MDE guidelines. Because we're all experiencing those reactions to George Floyd and other social injustices, I want to make sure I tell you about a great resource for talking to students about social justice called the Kaiser Permanente Playbook. It addresses the effects of COVID-19 on physical, mental, social, and economic well-being for schools and communities. For me, the strength of this document is that it provides an understanding of the systematic and structural racism embedded in this country. It also addresses how current evolving movement for racial justice affects children and families and impacts schools. It provides insight to being open to processes and procedural changes that can help meet public health guidelines and address health concerns affecting teaching and learning, and also provides insight for identifying and managing existing challenges that might act as barriers for schools, like funding cuts, workforce shortages, and lack of school space. Here are some examples I found going out in Minnesota schools right now concerning teachers talking to their students about racism. For really young children, early childhood experts and educators have written op-eds, curated lists of anti-racism children books, and shared other resources to help guide parents. Meanwhile, many local preschool and kindergarten teachers have taken the lead, adapting their final distance learning lesson plans to help their students think more deeply about racial injustices and inclusivity. These are some responses from teachers when asked how they are talking with students about George Floyd, protests, and racism. By reaching out, facilitating discussions, listening, sending messages of support, addressing it directly, and scrapping lesson plans to utilize teachable moments. Here's an example how one teacher is explaining protest virtually. There are also stories about how Minnesota young people are initiating conversations in their school districts about educational reform. This is just for your own information to help schools follow the data and see what districts are in what learning model. There is the Safe Learning Model dashboard. It's an interactive map that has an option to filter the data by school district or charter school name, learning model type, grade level, and effective date. Wow, we've covered a lot of information in a very short period of time. I want to tell you again how much I appreciate you and all your work. And now is a time that the importance of health and physical education is so visible. Stay the course and contact me if you need anything. I'm going to close with this presentation with a great quote from the President of Education Minnesota. Learning safely is the goal. It should be done in person when we can and at a distance when we must. What is safe must be defined by the latest data, the best scientific analysis, and with that eye on local racial disparities that haunt our society. I leave you with the following. Wash your hands, stay home if you're sick, wear a mask, and practice social distancing. Thanks for all you do for health and physical education in Minnesota. Thank you so much for your time today, and just know I got you. Don't hesitate to contact me if you need anything.